Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. It's a real honor to be part of this discussion, these high level discussions. And I've been encouraged by what I've heard thus far. And I wanted to drill down a little bit and get into some more specifics and some details on some of the root causes of waste. And before I do that, if you bear with me 1 second, I just need to finish my snack here. I do apologize. Oh, pardon me. The the ugly American has arrived apparently. Obviously, I would never do something as gauche and theatrical as that in real life. I'm not someone who litters, and let's be honest, no one really does that anymore. No one litters with such wanton lack of respect for our environment. Yet at the same time, we're doing something much worse, throwing away food and on a widespread basis. And not only is throwing away food the normal course of action, it's something that we're teaching our children to do as the current status quo exists. And so we would never litter for a few reasons. First of all, because it's illegal, right? And I will recycle that at the end of our talk. But also, in many cases, it's against our social code or against the mores of society. And that has not happened in the United States, at least, and throughout much of the developed world with wasting food. So, just a little food for thought as we get started. And I would offer it's a note of positivity because just as we have essentially made littering forbidden and non existent, so too will we turn our attention toward food waste and make it a thing of the past. So, what I'll get into today, here's a quick menu. I'm going to get into some of the numbers and the locations of waste before focusing on those root causes that I mentioned. And then the all important part, the main course really is the solutions and what we can do. And I'll try to be somewhat universal in those descriptions, and hopefully it will be applicable not only to those of you from Sweden, but elsewhere throughout Europe. And I'd love to hear from you afterwards, and hopefully we can have a bit of a dialogue, and I can learn from you all as well. So to get into some of the numbers, as you can see, the percentages are fairly staggering. To have about 1/3 of global food not being used is a real tragedy and a lost opportunity for feeding the roughly 1 billion hungry or so in this world. And then in the United States, the percentage is actually greater. To my great embarrassment and shame, about 40% of all food produced in the United States is in fact wasted. You can see the costs are fairly significant as well. And quite surprisingly to me at least, and perhaps to you as well, on the household level, we're not using about 1/4 of the food we bring into our homes. So there's a real opportunity there. But anyhow, those are just a bunch of numbers. I am someone who enjoys putting visuals on those factors. And so here's one way to think about that. If America were to bring all of its food wasted in one single day to one central location, then we'd have enough to fill this massive 90,000 seat stadium, the Rose Bowl in California. So every day America's wasting that much food. To try to localize those images a tiny bit, if we were to apply that to Sweden, there would be enough food to fill Friends Arena 2 times over. That's from all of the food wasted in America in one day. And even closer to here, the Gamla Levy, not too far away, we could fill that 5 times with wasted food, unfortunately. So, where's all this waste coming from? The short answer is everywhere. We're wasting food from farm to fork, and each sector has a responsibility there as well. So the waste starts on the farm level, where oftentimes food items never leave the farm or packing setting because they don't look quite right. They're the wrong shape, size, or color, or God forbid they have a small blemish. Those items are cast aside and not used. Additionally, on a macroeconomic level, oftentimes entire fields aren't harvested because the price of a good might not justify the harvest. So you'll have what they call walk-bys, where essentially the farmer walks by that field and lets it lie there and then plows it under along with some other things. And so that's a real unfortunate segment of the waste chain because it's the most nutritious and in many cases the most local food available that's being plowed under. Anyhow, the waste continues on to the retail level, where in many cases you have food that's not being used due to a date stamped on its package. And we'll talk about those a little more in depth later. But the waste certainly continues at the restaurant or canteen or cafeteria level. And oftentimes you'll have images like that at pretty much any kind of large gathering. That may or may not be a picture from this particular conference. We can discuss that later. But that unfortunately is not that rare of an image when it comes to the all-you-can-eat cafeteria-style serving. And then finally, the waste continues at the household level, and often we fill our home refrigerators to the point that we couldn't possibly use all of that food before it goes bad. We don't like the sight of a near empty or even sparse refrigerator, and as a result, there's a certain waste level that comes at a cost of keeping our refrigerators filled to a pretty significant level. So, what's going on here? Why are we wasting so much of our food? Whether it's 1/3 or 40%, it's a significant portion throughout the developed world. And I'll go through a couple of root causes, but primarily in the United States, there's a certain abundance that leads to so much of our wasted food. And what I mean there is that we're producing twice the amount of calories that we need per person. And given that specific fact there's two outcroppings or byproducts of that excess. First, we're eating too much. Second, we're wasting a significant amount of food. Now, this image here comes from a gleaning outing in North Carolina where I live. And those are all sweet potatoes that had been picked by volunteers that otherwise would have been plowed under and not used. And the thing is, we could have been out there for a week and still not recovered or harvested all of those sweet potatoes. And that encapsulates that sheer level of abundance on the farm level. And just a final point on this concept of abundance, because we see food everywhere we go, because it's stacked high at the supermarket, it's at all kinds of retail outings or operations, it creates this notion in our mind that we don't have to be careful with our food because there's plenty of it. And as a result, we are anything but careful with that food. Beauty is the next factor at play when it comes to wasted food. And what I mean there is that we have reached this point where appearance trumps taste. So we are eating with our eyes, and the unfortunate byproduct of that is that anything that doesn't look quite right, whether it's the wrong shape or size or color, anything like that is cast aside, and we demand this beauty and perfection, but also a homogeneity. So everything has to look exactly the same. Now, the next root cause here is cost, and despite rising food prices, when you look at the amount that we spend on food, in particular in the United States, it's appallingly low. It's at an all-time low. About 6% of our consumer spending is on food. By comparison, in Sweden, it's 12%. But much like the abundance factor, the cheapness impacts how we approach our food. And put simply, we don't tend to value things we don't spend much on. It's pretty straightforward. And I should also add that this cheapness or this cost factor at play is an artificial cheapness. It's in large part driven by commodity funding by the U.S. government on certain crops. So subsidies for corn, wheat, soy, and things of that nature leads to this artificial cheapness. And much like with gasoline, we aren't paying the true cost of that item. And that has dramatic impacts on how much we're wasting. Next, in much of the developed world, but certainly in the US, there's been a loss of food knowledge. And what I mean there is that we have essentially stepped out of the kitchen. We're eating out more often. Younger people aren't learning to cook as their older ancestors once had. And as a result, we don't know how long things will last. We're not great at creating new meals from old leftovers. And we're certainly a lot worse at canning or pickling items to keep them through the winter, as our ancestors once were forced to do. So part of it is convenience. We don't have to learn these skills, and so we don't. And so into that void, you see certain labels like this one that I received on a to-go box from a restaurant, and it says, "When in doubt, throw it out," right there at the bottom. And I think that's the exact wrong message to be sending. I think, in fact, we should give our food the benefit of the doubt. But that's not the opinion of many in the United States, and you can probably make out in the small print, perhaps not, but the advice they're giving is to use that food within 24 hours of receiving it. Now that might be good advice if you don't have a refrigerator at home, but it's probably a bit extreme if you do. And unfortunately, we're constantly receiving these messages of fear-mongering, and we don't want to have anyone get sick. And it's in part driven by the fear of lawsuit, but in part driven by a lack of knowledge on how food will operate. And one other implication of this lost food knowledge is that we see these expiration dates on just about every food item these days. So it's not only on individual eggs, but on shelf-stable items like rice or pasta, and on my favorite, bottled water. I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I had water that had gone sour. But we'll see. This one, I think we have to drink this before 2019. So don't push those limits to 2020 because it'll be quite dangerous. The thing about these expiration dates is they're different in many countries, but in the United States, they speak to the quality of the food, not the safety. And so if you're treating that as the ultimate date on when a food will be good or not, you're throwing away plenty of good food. Okay, and the final driver of so much of our waste in the developed world is the massive portions that we receive at restaurants and unfortunately in some homes. So I'll be honest with you, I have no idea what that's a picture of. I would guess that it's an egg dish of some sort. It probably has a lot of cheese in it as well. But what I'm pretty certain about is that that's more than you would want to eat at one time. And we're constantly being put in this position of either having to overeat or waste food. And in many cases, you can actually do both. You can eat too much food and still have plenty left to waste if you're served enough. Now, obviously, there's a few solutions there, but leftover taking being one of them. But you might not like leftovers. You might not be going straight home. So unfortunately, we need to try to resolve that problem and get past the massive portions that we see in so many restaurants. And I will fully admit that this is a problem born in America. Unfortunately, this is starting to be exported elsewhere. So an image of that here. From this very building, I was reading about the king-size shrimp sandwich, 200 grams of shrimp on one plate. So all that to say, this the massiveness of portions is not unique to the United States, although unfortunately I also read that this was imported. The idea itself came from the United States. So once again, I'll point a finger of blame inward. But anyhow, moving on, the all-important thing is how we get past some of those factors and root causes of food waste. And the next portion here, I have it split into 3 sections. I'm going to talk about some of the big picture solutions, the society-wide solutions, but then also some of the individual actions that we all can take. And since we're at a packaging conference, I'll discuss some of the solutions germane to packaging. So yeah, let's start with some of the big picture ideas. And when I think about trying to get into that 40% waste figure, to try and attack that massive volume of food waste, it's really important to focus on this hierarchy of actions. And so, as Selena mentioned, we don't want to just focus on the root causes, or sorry, we don't want to focus on the end results, but rather the root causes. So at the top of that hierarchy, you see source reduction, which is simply saying we need to try to minimize the amount of food we're wasting. And that is of the utmost importance. If we can't do that, then we need to try to redistribute some of that excess food waste. If we can't do that, then we need to try to feed animals or livestock as humans have done for millennia. If we can't do that, then we should be creating energy from our excess through anaerobic digestion primarily. If we can't do that, then composting is the next best solution. And only if we can't do any of the above should we be throwing away food or incinerating it. Now, the bad news here is that in the United States, the reality is completely flipped. It's the total inverse, and 95% of the available food waste is incinerated or sent to a landfill, and both have their environmental harms associated with them. So to try to remedy that solution, what I would love to see is a landfill ban on food and food waste. And it's not completely improbable. There's a partial ban here in Sweden. Several other European nations have similar initiatives. And in the United States, we're starting to see some states, some individual states like Massachusetts, Vermont, and Connecticut, who have set these food waste bans and making it illegal to throw away food. Now you might be thinking this is kind of counterintuitive. Why would you attack the end of the food chain to try to impact other parts of that food chain? But to me, making it illegal to throw away food would have a dramatic impact back through all the other segments of our food chain. And if you knew you weren't simply going to be able to throw away that food, maybe you'd be more careful about how you buy that food or how much of it you grow. And so that's a real opportunity. Next, I would love to see some action from the government level in terms of creating better data, better numbers on how much food is lost and where in the food chain. At present, in the United States, we have some idea on how much is lost overall, but no idea where the breakdown occurs and how much is lost at the farm level or at the household level. We have a sense that those are the two keys, the farm level and homes, but no specific numbers. And conversely, there's been a lot of action in Denmark and in the UK, some government funding on tallying and getting better data on how much is lost. This image here is from the RAP campaign in Britain, a a government-funded or quasi-governmental organization where they've done that hard research and come out with detailed findings, and the media has certainly latched onto it, and it has reaped benefits in terms of reduced waste. And they've also made these campaigns, these promotional materials, as you see here, and they've been very effective. I always am a bit puzzled as to why the pear is crying. Seems like that should be happy news, that the pear won't be eaten, but maybe he's not able to fulfill his destiny, so maybe the pear is a bit sad. Anyway, moving on. I'd love to see a public awareness campaign similar to the rap one, or even similar to Woodsy the Owl, who graced American TV screens and got people thinking about pollution. Anything to reach out and get people thinking about food waste and seeing it, because it is a problem that does tend to hide in plain sight in many cases, because the waste just goes away. It doesn't stick around, so we don't tend to notice it. It's out with the trash, or hopefully the compost, and it's something that is difficult to see if you're not looking for it. I am flexible about what that campaign would look like, what kind of animal or mascot would be the best potential use of graphics, but we can discuss that later perhaps. And two more big picture solutions I'd love to see. As Selena mentioned, in Denmark there's a great attention on schools and young people, and to date there's nothing of the sort in the United States and in most countries, and as a result we're teaching kids that it's cool or at least normal to waste food. It's the standard course of action, and I believe that the way to really prompt change is to start with young people. Not only are they the future, but they go home and they convince their parents to do things differently. And that's how the recycling message became so widespread 10 or 15 years ago. And following that same path will not only reduce food waste, but make our planet a healthier place, in addition to making our society a better place. And then finally, we need to do better at recovering food or redistributing that excess. There's a tremendous amount of edible but unsellable food, and rather than simply trying to compost that or even feed animals, we should be trying to feed people. There are plenty of hungry folks in this world, about 1 billion or so. And so, from my perspective, where there's a will, there's a way. Now, in the United States, there's a federal shield law. There's a legal protection for the donors of food. They can't be sued and found liable for anyone getting sick. And that's one reason why here is one area where the United States is leading the way, because there's less reluctance to donate food. Because despite there being plenty of lawsuits in the United States, here's one area where supermarkets and restaurants and caterers know that they are protected and they'll be completely free of liability for donating food. So we've talked a lot about those bigger picture changes, but now's the time to literally and figuratively point the finger out at you all and empower you as people who can be part of the solution. So we all are eaters. We all have refrigerators. Unless you're a robot, you're someone who is part of this food chain. I don't think there are any robots or zombies out there, but if you are, just politely nod. Anyway, we all are eaters, so we can all be part of this solution. So first off, let's try to be wise on portion size and not create those unfortunate situations where you receive that massive amount of food. Now that image there, that portion might be a bit extreme, might be a little bit on the small side, but taking into account how much food that restaurant serves, how hungry you are, it might be wise to share a meal or get a small plate. But essentially, we're trying to avoid this situation, trying to keep that massive portion away, especially if you're not someone who likes to take leftovers home. And I would add that on this topic of servings, it's really vital to think about what value looks like and maybe redefine value in the food system. In the United States, unfortunately, we've reached this point where the main objective or the main indicator of value is the sheer number of calories per dollar, the biggest bang for the buck. And I would argue that it's time to shift that value equation more toward healthier foods, more organic and humanely raised foods, more local commodities as well. Anyhow, when you're thinking about how you buy food, there's real room for change there. We are overbuying to a certain extent for most of us, and so as a result, maybe it's time to rethink that strategy, rethink how you shop for food. Maybe going more often to the store and buying less each time. That will lead to less waste. But I recognize that you all have busy lives, a lot of conferences to attend. So maybe you're going to make that once a week shopping trip. And if you are, then it's really important to plan out your meals, make that grocery list, and then actually stick to that list in the store, resisting those temptations, especially with fresh items. Now, I realize I sound like a complete nag when I'm saying these things, but it's true, and it's going to help you avoid waste. One word of caution I would add, just be careful who gets to add things to your shopping list. If you have kids around, you might end up with some really weird items on that list. I think it was supposed to be snacks, but it's written as snakes. So be careful. Next, let's try to be more accepting of all kinds of foods. The ugly food movement is rapidly gaining steam, both in Europe and the U.S. And it's a beautiful thing because it parallels this notion that just as no two people are created alike, no two foods are either. And so we have to be more accepting and not so focused on appearance. And this is an Intermarché campaign from France, the Inglorious Fruits and Vegetables. And it's really caught on, and it's kind of fun, it's quirky, and there is a certain truth, though, underlying all of that gloss and fun, and that's that food is perfectly edible and perfectly fine, yet our demands, we as consumers, our certain specifications are driving a lot of food waste. And retailers will say that they would love to stock more food, but shoppers have proven to want that perfect homogeneous display. So here's an opportunity for us to state the opposite, and when you see food that looks a little different, we can act on that and make our views known. Next, it's key to avoid clutter and to avoid that situation that we saw from before where we fill our refrigerators to the point that we couldn't possibly use all of those fresh foods. Now that might mean buying less, but it certainly means making things visible and neat. And so Selena mentioned the strategy of putting the newer foods in the back and pushing the older foods to the front. That's one way to do it. Another way is to have a certain shelf where you put certain items that you know you need to eat rather quickly. Also, keeping things visible is so key because out of sight is out of mind, and we're not going to think about those items. They're going to just become refrigerator casualties, and we want to try to avoid that where possible. So one other solution that Selena echoed as well is using that freezer as not just a waste delayer, but a waste avoider. So you want to avoid those UFOs, the unidentified frozen object, by putting it in the freezer, but then actually using it. and that's kind of important. But you'd be amazed at what kinds of foods you can freeze. Just about anything can be frozen and then revived with very little loss of quality. I've even done that with milk. It works fine. You just have to mix it up a little bit. Certainly bread is another good one. And if a word of advice, a pro tip for you, if you're going to freeze bananas, take them out of the peel first, because that's no fun. All right, just one final bit of universal advice here as a way we can all do better at avoiding waste. One simple strategy is just to connect with your food, to get closer to your food supply, whether that means growing your own, buying from local producers, or even something as simple as cooking. It's not that difficult. Kids can cook. Heck, even cats can cook these days. I think you'd be surprised if you think you might not have enough time in the average day. I think you'd be pleasantly surprised to see that it's very achievable. But however we do it, we need to get closer to our food, because that will make us more sustainable eaters, but also make it more difficult to waste food. And there have been studies that have tracked students and their involvement in food, and they found a dramatic reduction in waste when kids grow their own. And a lot of people will say that kids don't like vegetables, but when they grow their own lettuce and broccoli, all of a sudden it takes on a new life, and they see all that goes into it, and that makes it harder to waste. Okay, so I promised a discussion of some packaging items, and here goes. So, and just to start off, I would say that there is this notion, at least I hear it in the United States, that packaging is all bad because it's all just a waste of resources. And I don't subscribe to that, and I don't pay tons of attention to packaging, to be perfectly honest, because I know that food waste has a much higher carbon footprint than packaging. So to me, any packaging used to avoid food waste is great. It's fabulous. And so from that perspective, I see packaging as a way to help in this fight against food waste. I promise I'm not just saying this because we're at Scanpack. I would say that anywhere. But how that actually would work, well, there's a couple of ways. Smarter packaging certainly is one way to do that, and essentially finding ways to package food where it vents certain gases or moisture to avoid spoilage. That's one avenue for change. You see some of the specifics there. There are many solutions, and I've had a chance to talk with some people just today about some solutions for waste through packaging. There are plenty, but I would also advise not to get too carried away. Maybe wrapping individual bananas is a bit extreme, especially if you're using the polystyrene that is shown in that image there. Expiration dates. I promised that I would return to that topic, and it's one we could talk about for a while, but I'll try to keep it focused here. Essentially, expiration dates in the US are voluntary. They're put on by manufacturers who want you to eat their food within a certain range and at its peak freshness. So that makes perfect sense. But because so many consumers treat that date as the gospel truth on when that food will not be good, they have become problematic. And the date labels do communicate that there's a certain point in time where food dies, and that's just not how it works. So the semantics are problematic. The term expiration date implies that food just dies or expires at midnight on the date stamped on that package. And if you're treating that as the scenario of what's going to happen, you're going to be throwing away a lot of good food. So I think it's important to change the terminology and to communicate that there's a range of edibility. So that image there, it would be one way to do it. It's a little bit jokey, but however we communicate that there's not one set point where food's good and then all of a sudden it's not good. I think we'd be much better served to approach it that way. Now, one other factor at play with packaging is instead of relying on those dates as we do so heavily, let's try to involve some science in how we approach the goodness question. So there are several advances that I've seen in the past few years that are measuring the quality of that food, mostly through gas emissions, and doing so in a way where we're not simply throwing away that food based on the date label. And this is an example from the UK called Bump Mark. That's kind of neat. And essentially there's a gel in that corner, and the gel decomposes at the same rate as the meat. And when the gel decomposes, you can feel the bumps. So if you can feel bumps, then that means it's not that great. And it's directly tied to the decomposition of what's in the package. So there are plenty of ways to get around that date label and plenty of opportunities for innovation. And so that's where the packaging industry can certainly help. A slightly less scientific approach would be to simply make those packages clear so that we can actually see what's inside. I know that's not exactly rocket science, but what's out of sight tends to be out of mind. So when you get something from a restaurant and you can actually see what it is, that helps. The same certainly is the case for households, so that we can actually know what we have in our refrigerator. And finally, on the topic of packaging, I'd love to see us make doggy bags more of the norm. But I'm not really talking about that kind of doggy bag. Definitely not that kind of doggy bag, but rather this kind. And I know there are some cultural issues at play on whether or not it is acceptable or even normal to take food home from a restaurant, but here's an opportunity where I think there's room for change. And if we can have something like le doggy bag take hold in France, where it has been held as quite gauche for a long time to take food home from restaurants, there's room for hope anywhere. And so from my standpoint, from my perspective, it's your food, you've paid for it, it's the green thing to do, so why wouldn't you take that food home? Now, the thing is, you have to actually eat it once you get it home. It doesn't do any good to take it home and then throw it out a week later. And you might remember me saying at the beginning that packaging has a much smaller carbon footprint, so we don't need to worry about wasting that or using it in the name of avoiding food waste. But if you're going to just throw that food out when you get it home, or do so 7 days later, then that's not a fabulous use of those resources. But I think that it can catch on. Selena mentioned the doggy bag or goodie bag program. I actually brought this with me because I'm such a fan, and I love the word play. You know, it's not for your dog. We don't have to pretend that we're going to take that food home and feed our pets with it. Well, we can actually say it's a goodie, and it's a little treat that we can have the next day for lunch or dinner. And I hope that this kind of attitude can take hold. All right, so to wrap up here, it's time for us to get to work on reducing food waste, especially in the United States where we are lagging behind. On that point, the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Agriculture, they've just set this goal of reduction. They said, let's try to produce 50% less waste by 2030. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals has the same end goal of 50% reduction by 2025. And so whichever timetable we hold to, we're going to have to step up our actions. If we want to see this happen If we don't want to fill that whole stadium every day, maybe we want to minimize that by 50%. We're going to have to get to work. And my main take home of the day is that everyone has a role to play. So every step of the food chain from farm to fork is wasting food. We're all part of the problem, but ergo, we can all be part of the solution. And so those small changes will add up, and especially for us as individuals, the little change that you as one person makes will be noticed by others, by your friends, your family, and it will be contagious. And as we've seen in many places, that change can be quite rapid because wasting food makes no sense. It has harmful ethical, environmental, and economic consequences. So it's really just a matter of illuminating the problem, and then the solutions will follow. And just to bring up the stakes at play here, in 2050 there are going to be an estimated 9.6 billion people on this planet. That's a lot of zeros that you see behind me, and it's a lot of mouths to feed. So how we go about doing that will certainly vary. There are many suggestions on how we go about feeding those 9.6 billion people. But before we turn to GMO crops on a widespread basis, and before we cut down more rainforest in South America to grow more food that's wasted at 33%, let's try to be a bit radical and be simple in how we're radical by being more efficient with the food we do have. And quite simply, we have enough food on this planet to feed everyone, and it's just a matter of summoning up the political and social will to get that food to people who need it. And we really need to do a better job, because right now we have that paradox of 1 billion hungry people on the planet while 33% of all food is not being used. So instead of ending on that downer note, I think that is room for hope, and there's a real opportunity here. And I feel that positive energy in this room and at this conference, and hopefully now you can all become somewhat ambassadors for this issue and pushing the solutions on reducing food waste, because quite frankly, they're not only virtuous, but in many cases actually delicious. So thank you so much for your time.